Hey everybody. So as requested, I'm going to be talking a little bit about writing. But rather than focusing specifically on the act of writing or techniques associated with it, or addressing things particularly from the standpoint of consuming a written work as a reader, I wanted to try to pick a topic that would be hopefully equally interesting to both writers and readers. And so I'm going to focus here on the idea of context. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the dictionary definition of context or just haven't really sat down and thought about it, I'm going to put it down here at the bottom of the screen so you can check it out as I talk. But I basically want to focus on two particular areas regarding context that I think are really important to both writers and readers. First off, let's talk about the use of dark themes in writing. Things like death, betrayal, deception, and other heavy, weighty topics. For the sake of example, let's just take a simple sentence like, "He killed the man." Now, in isolation and taken by itself, that sentence could be interpreted in a bunch of different ways by the reader. There's really no context as to why he, the subject of the sentence, took the action that he did against the man or the object of the sentence. But by adding a little bit of context, it can drastically change both the reader's perception and understanding of the situation being described and shift the tone of the overall piece. For example, if we say, "He killed the man who murdered his father," or "He killed the man who slept with his wife," or "He killed the man while driving drunk," or "He killed the man and took his watch." That little bit of extra context that's provided in each of those examples goes a long way towards establishing both the nature of the subject and the reasoning behind his actions. Now, of course, these are some very simplistic, blunt examples of this sort of thing, but they speak to the overall idea and pitfall that I think a lot of writers tend to fall into when working with dark themes. That being that the burden of context on the writer increases based on the stakes associated with the concept or subject being described. When considering all the different things that can be written about, there are certainly a handful of things that really stand out as big ticket, highly impactful subjects. Life and death, matters of the heart, disputes over wealth and power. All of these things have a certain weight to them that tends to almost immediately and thoroughly engage a reader. But the trick in using these sorts of things is understanding that by playing those cards as a writer, you're then obligated to provide an appropriate level of context. Now, don't get it twisted. Context is not the same as justification. And in fact, I could do a completely separate video specifically on the concept of justification in literature. But what we're focusing on for our purposes here is the simple act of logically and rationally explaining the methods and reasons behind a character's actions. And for the sake of simplicity, I think it's perfectly valid to say that context is the objective description of events in a given work, and justification is the subjective interpretation of those events. But at the end of the day, I think the real big takeaway here is the understanding that when you raise the stakes in a given narrative, your burden as a writer to justify the actions taking place and appropriately contextualize them increases. That's a really critical element to buying into the overall experience. How many times have you read a book or watched a movie or a television show or played a video game where the actions of the characters involved weren't appropriately contextualized and that took you out of the story? Now, it might seem like I'm saying that context is only important when stakes are really high in a narrative, but that's really not the case at all. Even the most light-hearted, whimsical, casual bits of entertainment benefit quite a bit from an appropriate and well-executed context. And to illustrate that, let me just give you an example of how I use context in pretty much every story that I write, regardless of the overall theme or tone. If you as a writer are introducing a character into a given narrative without establishing, at least in your own mind, the context of that character's existence outside the narrative, I think you're doing yourself and your readers a disservice. For example, in my case, when writing any significant character that has any sort of meaningful impact on a story, I tend to envision the entire lifespan of that character. In other words, I consider what their life was like from birth up until the point where they were introduced into the story, and then, assuming that they survive to the end of the story, I consider what the remainder of their life will be like upon its conclusion. And I would say that that is one of the most potent and important manifestations and implementations of context in writing. So hopefully you folks have enjoyed this video. Apologies for any of the jump cuts and editing, but this is my first time really doing a video in this style, so obviously I'm not going to be a pro at it just yet. But I did want to at least give it a try and specifically address the feedback that I got from my followers on Twitter who specifically requested this topic. So I'm going to pad out the end of this video a little bit because these days YouTube tends to favor videos that are a bit longer. And I also thought it might be interesting for you folks to get a little bit of background and insight into me and my history with writing, and some insight into why folks might be asking me to talk about something like this on YouTube. So I've actually been writing for about 30 years and doing various things like poetry, song lyrics, short and long form fiction, and specifically in my professional career, I've been formally trained in journalistic writing and done a lot of technical writing as an IT professional. But probably the most important, significant writing that I've done in my life took place last year when I published my first ever novel, which I'll link to in the description box down below. And I bring it up here because I feel it definitely does a very good job of illustrating the importance of context in writing, both in terms of properly leveraging the use of dark themes and thoroughly and intricately developing various characters. So if those sorts of things are important to you as a reader, then you might find it particularly interesting. As you might imagine, I've already begun work on a new novel, which I'm planning to release sometime in 2018. So be sure to follow me on Twitter or give me a sub here on YouTube if you're interested in following along with the progress on that. Having said all that, hopefully you folks have enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to hit that like button. If you'd like to see more videos from me in the future, be sure to hit subscribe, and I will see you next time.